Hello, everyone, and welcome to yet another episode of Rancher Live. I am Divya Mohan, and I am a principal technology advocate at SUSE. So, today's episode of Rancher Live is going to be slightly different because we are not going to be focusing on um, tech, so to say, or cloud native tech, even. We are going to talk about open source licensing, IP, copyrights, policies, etc. And now you may wonder why I am going in that direction. But I think if you've been living or existing in the open source ecosystem, whether it's cloud native or outside of it, you'd have noticed the amount of licensing changes that we've gone through in the past 1 year. Let's not even take 1 year. Let's take the past couple of months itself. We've gone through a lot of them. But that's not the only thing. We have also, um, you know, gotten a lot of AI stuff coming on the horizon, and we have a lot of laws and policies and initiatives being formed in this regard. So I think it's just fair to equip ourselves with knowledge ahead of time rather than struggling to find the right resources to understand this whole thing end to end when crunch time comes. So I'm not a lawyer. I do not understand a lot of stuff in the legal side of open source, which is why I do what I do. That is being an advocate for open source technologies. But I've got someone with me here today, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be hosting her right after State of OpenCon, last not last week, last month, where I like the chance to interact with her, but also learn from the various people who had attended State of OpenCon, and learn from her also. So if you're thinking who this person is, it's Amanda Brock, who's the CEO of OpenUK. Welcome, Amanda. And I'm not going to actually introduce you because I'm pretty sure I'm gonna, botch up the introduction and say things that I'm not supposed to say, and probably get the whole stuff wrong. So I'm gonna hand it over to you to talk about how you got started, your background,
Mhm.
and then
Okay.
maybe give us some insight into how you navigated your way into open source and how you're now the CEO of OpenUK.
Sure. I thought you were going to say we were two mad cat ladies in open source based on our conversation before we came live.
Yes.
So, as you say, Amanda, I'm an ex-lawyer, if you can be an ex-lawyer. I was a lawyer for 25 years, and I Open UK is at in a bit years now. I started my career in open source almost exactly 60 years ago. You would probably still have been in school then. And I was the general counsel. I was employee 185 in Canonical, a company that many of you will know, the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. And I guess I joined, initially I was only meant to go there for 3 months actually. And I was going to scope a project for them and help them to work out what their legal team should do. And I was going to move to Amazon to work on, I believe, would have been the Kindle, so their first electrical retail product. But I decided to stay with Canonical because I very quickly fell in love with open source, love with the concept of collaboration, of democratizing technology and sharing tech. So although as somebody in a commercial corporate lawyer for over 10 years, I was expected to come in and help with all the deals and structure the legal team. What I found was that I became part of the open source ecosystem. And I guess my love affair with open source started there and has continued across a journey where in 2019, before Brexit and before COVID, I was asked to come on board and run Open UK as it was built out as an industry organisation.
And that sounds like a really fantastic journey. But I also want to delve into that journey milestone of you coming on board um
Mhm.
on the Open UK team, because
Yeah.
as far as I've understood, at least from the one conference that I attended, it seems like it's a very special niche that you work with currently when you're talking about the Open UK organization. It's at the intersection
Mhm.
of learning, community, and also legal stuff that we are going to delve
Yeah.
into later. So, how did you exactly? I mean, obviously,
Yeah, yeah,
the
yeah.
being it's a background. I get that, but how exactly
Yeah. How
did
did
you
I get
get
involved in
interested in
that?
the niche? Yeah.
Okay. So somebody else had the idea of building an industry organization, a website, and set up a company. I was persuaded by them that I should get involved, and I had stopped being a lawyer. I wanted to work in open source, and I wasn't sure what to do. And when they first came to me, I said, no, I don't want to do that. I am part of the global tech sector. I'm part of the open source ecosystem. It's not focused on any one country. That doesn't really interest me. And I sat back and I watched what was happening with Brexit. And I saw that in Europe, there was lots of stuff powering ahead on open source. Whereas in the UK, we had been ahead. We had the world's first open source first policy in our public sector. And I felt we were lagging behind. So I talked again to them about it and said, like, if I do what I want with this, I'll do it. And effectively, I became a bootstrap founder because the organization had no money to pay me, and I had to go out and raise the money and build it the same way as any founder would from scratch. And with the help of an amazing board, about half of my existing board today are from that original half through 4 years have moved on, changes things. And what we've done is create what I think is the new model for industry organizations, because in particular, right? And we're about community. So instead of focusing on companies, although we depend on companies, we focus on people. So companies like Rancher fund us. This year is Rancher Susie. So this is Susie's first year of being a sponsor at Open UK, and you also joined us in the conference, which is great. So we rely on that sponsorship to allow us then to engage people. And what we've done is we've brought together the community across the geographical area of the UK. Now, I don't think anybody else has really been successful to date in creating a community that doesn't have code at its heart. Wrong, I'd love to know. And I know like the OSI are starting, but it's very really have it. We have around 400 people engaged in Open UK who do things, whether they're sitting on an advisory board, whether they're in the leadership team pro bono, whether they're an ambassador. So we really focused on people. And what that's meant is bit by bit, we found more and more people in the UK who work in this space. We also take a slightly different approach to what we cover. So originally the organization was going to focus purely on open source software, and we didn't do that. We focused on software, hardware, data, which we think captures everything, including standards, including AI. And that allows us to bring this really broad community together, but to think about the underlying technology. Because when you look at software today, you have to think about data. When you look at AI, it really proves that point. And we were sort of 4 years ahead of the curve in that thinking. So we do, as you say, we bring that community together, and we do lots of celebration of their achievements through awards, through an honours list, through showcasing them in our reporting. And then we do events for them, and it's really nice. We've got this really strong community. You'll probably see it. You're on next week, and across KubeCon, you will see people talking about being part of the UK. Really people. So we have that collaborative community, and we voice in policy. So do that funding through trying to lead the conversation on policy. So you'll see again in cloud native that you're starting to talk more about sustainability, that you're starting to look at metrics. That's something we started 3 or 4 years ago, and I feel we've really led the way. We do a lot of reporting. You'll see Harvard did a report maybe a month or so ago on value rather course and shifted how they look at the economics. And again, that's something OpenUK was the first to do back in 2021, to look at the value generated. So being a small, agile organization with that proximity to the engineers, the business people, and bringing all of those folks together really allows us a deep insight and a collaborative environment that other organizations I don't think have quite achieved. And part of that is the quality and the kinds of people involved. So we have a really broad range of people. I think you probably saw this at State of OpenCon, which is our conference. We've just our second year. It's probably the diverse conference we've seen. It's visibly as well as invisibly diverse across open source, open tech, and possibly tech full stop. And we've just, had our stats back for this year. They're slightly down on last year, actually, on the delegate side, but you're sitting between 45 and 50% of our delegates not being white, around 30% being female, 30-something, I think it is. And then with our speakers, around 40% being female. And that's just really unusual, particularly when you've got over 200 speakers.
And that is unusual and commendable, because I did witness firsthand the diversity of speakers that you had at State of OpenCon. And not to say that other conferences don't have it, but there are fewer conferences that have such a
To
diverse
scale.
lineup. Yeah, and it's
Mm-hmm.
also at scale. It's not like it's a small conference. We had, I think, around 1,500 attendees this
Yeah,
time around. So it's
yeah,
not like we're talking about a very small scale conference here. We're talking about a sizable amount of people gathering at a venue. And I
yeah.
can say that it's a
And
sizable amount
also,
because, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
now what I was going to say to you, sorry to interrupt, but what I was going to say to you is also the feedback we get is that the content is at the high end of conferences. So people could say, you've got this really mixed, different group of people, and we bring a lot of people in who perhaps haven't been open source conferences other places, and open them up to the possibility. But actually, the quality of the content is phenomenal. So everybody who's on one of our stages has really merited their opportunity to speak.
I wouldn't disagree there at all, because there I caught up on a lot of recordings on my flight back. I think from SF the week after. Y'all were pretty quick to upload stuff too. So I ended up
Mm-hmm.
catching a lot of the talks on my flight back home, and I could not attend all of them, but the ones that I did catch up with were phenomenal. And not only in terms of the insights, because a lot of them come from very different backgrounds, right? So a lot of the
Yeah.
content was really, really phenomenal and eye opening, so to say. And I really enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to catching the next set that I have listed and downloaded in my next leg to Paris. So
You're
yeah,
very good.
I have. Yeah. So I want to take a slight detour here, because we spoke about how you're also setting the tone for um, not just open source policy and legal work with the Open UK organization, but no, and we're not talking about just the UK side of things, but also a little globally. But I want to touch base on how important that is when it comes to the open source ecosystem, right? Because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people are probably like me, who are tuning in, and they don't really get the um, noise around IP licensing and all the policy stuff that typically sounds very high level when you talk about it. So
Mm-hmm.
how important is it, especially in this day and age of companies switching licenses, and open washing, so to say. I learned that word
Yeah,
and I
yeah,
wanted to use it. So
Your other one is a
so
faux pen license. So open washing
yeah.
usually requires a faux pen license.
Yeah,
So you
so
want
that's
me to
that's
talk
something.
about licensing?
Yes, basically, I want to understand how important is it in the context of the open source ecosystem, and how it also is a direct effect on the sustainability side of things, because it does affect sustainability in the longer run, if not,
Mm-hmm.
in as an immediate side effect,
Yeah,
but it does affect it in the
yeah,
longer run. So, can you shed some light on those two
sure, sure,
points?
sure, sure. Yeah, so I think there's different pieces to unpack there. If you start with the licensing piece, understanding that gives you power, it gives you control, and it allows you to develop your future as a developer. It allows you to control how your code is going to be used, and it allows you, as you mature, to be part of projects and to influence how projects work. And the reason it's so important is that open source is a lot of different things. Is probably depends on how you come to it, right? If you've come to it through a corporate job, you'll think of it as a corporate thing. If you've come to it as an individual who is a community contributor, you'll think of it in that way. Whatever way you've come to it, at its heart is the sharing of code. And back in the day, originally there was no copyright on code, so we'd build their code and collaborate and share, and didn't have to worry about licensing. And most of that was done then through universities. Then in, I think, the 60s and 70s, we see governments applying copyright. Now, what that means is that nobody can take and use your code without you giving them a license. There are a couple of exceptions to that around the globe, but let's not get in, it's too lawyerly. Let's not get into that. Your basic rule is that copyright applies to the code that you write. And for anyone else to have a shot of your code, to get to use your code, you need to give them a license. And it's your choice whether you give them a free license, whether you give them an open source license, whether you give them a license with royalty. And what we see is many, many years, there were royalty only licenses that we were on the marketplace. A lot of engineers didn't want able to collaborate. A lot of the devs wanted to collaborate across companies. They wanted things, sometimes because they weren't allowed to do them at work, right? They had a problem, they had an itch that they wanted to scratch, to use the open source term, and they wanted to go off and do this thing and to work with other smart people who knew how to do it and to improve what they were doing and to collaborate and to innovate. Now, to do that, they couldn't just share copyright, they had to give a license. And over a period of time, we went through free software licensing and onto open source licensing. And the shift to open source was really generally to be more commercially friendly. That was the intention of it. And that's where we came up with this term open source, 25, 26 years ago. And we see open source licenses. Now, to be an open source license is an important and special thing. It has to comply with something called the open source definition, which Bruce Perens, who was at the conference, was one of he created that and was one of the founders of the open source initiative. And or the custodian of that definition, and to approve licenses as matching it. Now, there are 10 points in the definition, and nobody can tell you what they are. I doubt even Bruce could repeat them to you. What you do is you rely that the OSI has checked and approved a license, so it's okay to use. So you should go to the OSI and make sure that the license is approved by them. But in the main, we use 6 or 7 of those licenses, GPL2, Apache 2.0, BSD, MIT, AGPL. There's a handful of licenses that are the most popular, that are commonly used and that we all recognize. And to an extent, we understand, and they do different things. So you've got, and you've got permissive, where people do pretty much what you want. But there are 2 things that flow through. One is that generally you will be attributed, so somebody will credit you for your work, which is a good and nice thing, and I think quite important. And then the other thing is you'll say that I'm giving you this code with no liability. Now, if the law says, if a regulation or a law says that you have liability, that overrides the license. So you can't say I have no liability. It's to the extent the law allows you to. But you'll use one of these standard licenses, you'll be part of the open source ecosystem. And actually, the thing that I think is most important in all of that are definitions 5 and 6, and open source definition. And if you go back to that, roughly what they say is that anyone can use your code for any purpose. And that means we don't discriminate between people. or restrict the purpose, even if we don't ethically agree. So even if we have a moral or ethical reason we wouldn't want someone to use our code, if we apply that, it's not open source. And if we restrict commercially, and this is where we tend to see the problems, because if you have that commercial restriction, what it means is I let everybody have my code, but at some point I can step in and stop them because there's a commercial restriction and I have control of that ecosystem. And what open source does is almost the opposite of that, and it creates a free flow where anybody can use the code for any purpose. And if you know it's on an open source license, you can rely on that. So when we see companies shifting away from that, that creates friction. It breaks a community contract, really, and it causes problems.
And I just want to jog back to the fact that you mentioned Bruce parents, because I wanted to ask you a question, because I believe I caught it. I'm not sure which session it was, or if it was like one of the plenaries, but Bruce said that, open source as we know it is kind of dead, and we're living in a post-open world, and the only way to continue sustainably developing open source, not just software but in general the ecosystem, would be to have like a one license one contract model with like a third party non-profit organization spearheading the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
But you actually have vouched for like more governments coming in and supporting this. So do these like streamline at any point? Are they like
Mm-hmm.
two different views, or are they meeting at the middle somewhere? That's what I wanted to
Yeah.
ask. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. And I think if we start with why are Bruce and I talking about these things, why we're talking about these things is what you're talking about: open washing, license changes, companies that as they grow, poster children for open source like Elastic, actually, of course, shifting from open source licenses to proprietary licenses because they feel they need to do that to create the value, because they don't trust users to give back enough. We see the same problems existing for maintainers. So when we have open source packages or tools which are used across the ecosystem, or which build the platforms on, value generated by those companies is not matched by the recompense, the way that the maintainers are benefit from creating and maintaining that code. Now that's an imbalance. And what we're seeing is open source growing up, right? I mentioned it's 25, 26 years since the phrase was coined. And we're seeing it maturing. And we spent a very long time trying to get people to adopt it. According to last year's Synopsis report, we have 96% of stacks that have open source dependencies now. 76% of those are actually open source code. So you have to think about, how is this going to work? And we're learning. When I joined Canonical, it was really hard to get companies to use open source. Today, they are using it at scale. But what we don't see is their level of understanding matching their scale. We have a number of different issues in the ecosystem. There's others that you and I will come to, like AI, that impact this too. I don't know what the answer is, but I know that we are going to see shifts. And if open source is to survive, we need to see more money into the system. We need to see the maintainers being adequately compensated for their work. We need to see pressure being taken off them by more resource, more skilled individuals. So there's a sort of landscape of solutions. Now, Bruce's concept isn't a bad one, and it's one he and I are talking more about, and I know that there will be more community conversations around it. But when you have a single entity, it has to be funded. And I don't think our views are actually so far apart. I don't necessarily know that I want a single entity. Maybe I do. I need to think more about that. But what I want to see is a funding pot that is huge. And I don't mean that, there's a sovereign tech fund in Germany that has 10 or 15 million. I believe they're trying to get it up to 50 million. To me, 50 million is a drop in the ocean. What we're looking at is our national infrastructure, our national critical infrastructure, our enterprises being built almost entirely on software today. Every company that's been formed in the last 3 years is using open source. How do we make sure that money is injected back into that ecosystem adequate scale to allow it to thrive. Now, of course, it'll save money because that collaborative innovation does, but it has to be something where we accept there's a cost. So I don't think Bruce and my ideas are necessarily not in tandem. I think what we're to do, and a lot of people who are thinking about this space are trying to do, are work out the options. And I have no doubt that government funding is a part of that. I think the government funding will come with identifying open source as a public good. And I think that there will be enterprise funding needed too. So I think the solution is likely to be a public-private initiative. I suspect that having one foundation or one dominant foundation even would be unhealthy, and that possibly what we need is more foundations to hold the code. I don't want to get too lawyerly. AI Act, which was approved yesterday in Europe, and if you look at the Cyber Resilience Act, what you see is liability and burden being placed on engineers if they make any money out selling services or whatever, which most people will be caught by that. And it's a really, really heavy burden in terms of compliance. Big companies will easily be able to work with. And the reality is that the innovation starts with a small group of people. And often that's not in a big company. That's often a small group who are doing this in their spare time, who are doing this thinking they're going to build a business around it. And the big companies too, because they often buy, that's often where the innovation comes from. I mean, if we look at Rancher, I've watched the growth of Rancher over a number of years, and Shannon, did a brilliant job. But again, you see companies like SUSE buying a company like Rancher, which demonstrates how that innovation works. And we need to be able to allow individuals and SMEs to flourish in this space. So I think there is a whole picture that we have to navigate carefully, and that the people making laws around us don't understand. It is quite nuanced, it's quite complex. For you, understanding some of the legal stuff is a challenge. You can imagine for somebody who doesn't even understand the tech landscape, trying to understand the nuances of open source and how a community works, and how do I list of who's in this community.
And when you were talking about not following one approach or another, or it being more of a public private initiative, I just had this question pop up. Even if we not go even if we don't go one way or another, right? Even if we somehow manage to uh, think about something that works in tandem and joins both of your ideas. Again, it's a very long term thing, very nuanced. I'm not going to say that
Yeah.
I know a lot about it, but I estimate that there would be like transnational challenges that you would actually have, primarily
Yeah.
because all countries across the globe are not at the same level of adoption or even policy making, or we know that like there are different countries, different continents having different levels of adoption for with respect to open source technologies, and policies are widely different across the globe. So wouldn't that be like an additional challenge that you would have to navigate? Again, not a lawyer, but I just felt like
No, no,
that's a
no.
question. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think you're totally right. What you see is the landscape and the journey that companies go on and governments and public sectors go on is one that's replicated. Now, the actual iteration of it in each country has to be slightly different, because each country has slightly different concerns. And I think there's a huge thing where AI could be a real problem for open source, and it could also be a really big help. And one of the ways it's a help is that governments are starting to understand that making laws and policies on their own is a problem, because that's not how the global tech sector works. And we talk about open source here in the UK. We've done a lot of thinking about this, and we understand that we contribute 20-30% of the GVA into the UK. So we economically contribute a lot, but they don't know we exist. And they don't know we exist. We don't tend to be visible here. we're visible wherever the global tech sector is. So you and I were just chatting before this and talking about we'll see each other in different cities around the world through the course of the year, because that's where we convene people who are interested in open source, people who contribute, people who are part of those global communities. And even OpenUK, our purpose is UK leadership and global collaboration, because we need to work, we focus locally, but we collaborate globally because we need to work together. The policymakers are trying to get their heads around that, and they have friction because they're trying to deal with two things. They're trying to deal with being worried about what's happening in their local country and whether their own tech sector is strong enough and pushing the big techs out. And then they're also worrying about the citizens having the right tools to be digitally enabled. And I think there's a nicer way than we're seeing at the moment of doing that, where it's more collaborative. And we recognize that we are a global tech sector in the same way as every country will have a light bulb, a road. We all need the same digital tools. It's just that we might tweak them slightly for our environments to suit the hot weather where you are, the cold weather where I am, and everything slightly different. And we have to take that flavor for the country. But I think what we can see is that vanilla base is global, and we need governments to work together more. Now, AI is opening them up to thinking about that. And I'm very hopeful that as they think and they start to collaborate more, they'll see that applies more. So maybe to things like cloud, to open source, and they'll start to engage more on a standard. I think we're seeing, not quite sure how they make it happen, trying to work these things out. This is the first time they've dealt with digitalization at scale.
Yep. And the thing with AI is, I think people, again, we're trying to figure out the definition of what it means to be truly open when it comes to AI. Although
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that there's like the 10-point definition that you already spoke about, but a lot of the companies and a lot of the organizations and a lot of the policymakers are trying to figure out this openness
Mm-hmm.
in AI. Primarily because I think um, a lot of people associate openness in AI, which was also a topic, major topic at State of OpenCon, by the way. So if y'all want to further check out that, y'all should on the Open UK channel. But the question was more around does actually open source AI equal having open weights, or is open weights just like a nice way to
Mm-hmm.
distribute it? And open source
Yeah.
AI truly just really means like the code is available along with the weights. So I know that it's been widely debated,
Mm-hmm.
and there's been a lot of conversations at State of OpenCon, but I'd also like you to shed some light on that if you can.
Sure. Sure. What's really funny is you don't realize how topical you are, because this week of all weeks, and you could probably say that most weeks with AI and openness, but this is an important week. So yesterday, the European Parliament approved the AI Act, and that's the first piece of legislation anywhere in the world on AI, and getting that in place is quite an achievement. I'm not sure that I'm a fan of it, because I think that what it potentially will do is inhibit innovation. And I think it's very complex in its provisions. And the problem with trying to regulate AI right now is the pace of change that it's going at, right? So we're seeing this moving so fast that by next week, there'll be something different. In 6 months' time, there'll be something different. And
Exactly.
although that becomes law, a lot of the things that are within it take a year or two to come into force. So I'm not sure that's the right approach. But they have, it's a major achievement to get it in place. I'm just not sure it's the right thing to have done. Here in the UK, we're taking a much slower approach, and our regulators are talking about building
Yep.
understanding and being pro-innovation. And I think
Yes.
that's super important. And there are about 8 companies in the world which have led, and they need to be compensated because they have put huge amounts of money, huge amounts of resource, huge amounts of compute into developing that AI. But we don't want our future to end up in the hands of a few individuals. That's not the way
True.
society works. And what we want is to democratize that and to open up. Now, what opening up means is confusion being, but open water, as you would call it, right? You've used that a few in this space. We know what open source is. We know what open source software is because we have a definition we've had for nearly 30 years that
Exactly.
we rely on, right? So that's fixed. We also actually know a lot about open data, and it's not just the AI that does the process, data that goes in and the content that comes out that we care about, because that allows us to check how AI is making its thinking, right? So whatever data set it's trained on, it's important to know, and it's important to know what the content of that is, and to have a labeling system or the like, or a documentation system that helps us with that, whether it's cards, whatever we're using. So you've already got the software, then you've got the data, and then you've got the weights and models and algorithms and different components that will change over time. But what we need to really have something open isn't clear. I think the way that we get to what that is, though, is we take the component parts and we look at, is this software compliant with the open source definition and shared on an open source? Is the data to license? And then look at the weights and look at how those are shared. And where we need to create a new license or amend an existing license. I'm not a fan of creating a new definition. I think it's too late. I think we had to do it a long time ago, because now what we're seeing is starting. So yesterday, the European Commission put in place a free and open source, and that's there now. So we have the first law. If we already had something to hand them, it would have been fine, but we don't. And I don't think that we can now, we're putting ourselves now, if we try to define it, into the position that the regulators are in, and it's sort of become their job. And what I think we need to do is persuade them the meaning of open source, if that's going to protect, and the data licenses that exist and the worth of those. We've engaged quite a lot in OpenUK because the UK government is looking at that, and we deal with the policy in the UK government, which tends to be the same as people are doing in other countries. So we've worked with a number of partners, companies like Stability AI, which come out of the UK. We talked to people like AutoGPT, which you probably know. I think it's the fastest growing open source AI repo in the world, and it is up in Edinburgh created that. So we talk
Yep.
to that ecosystem of people to help understand what they want. They want it to work. And I think, interestingly, as it stands, the UK is likely to go down the route of a code of conduct. And I think that's not a bad. The way AI will work is it's a tool, like the cloud is, like the internet is. And when you look at how that's used, it's already regulated. So if you're talking about banking, say, the financial sector has regulation. If you're talking about healthcare, the healthcare sector has regulation. What we want is our tools to meet those standards. So when somebody chooses to use a tool in a regulated sector, they choose to choose a tool that's suitable. They're using it business to business or business to consumer. There are different considerations, but they're practical business considerations and technical considerations, right? And one of the things that I really learned in open source is that the solution is often not a law. The solution is often a technical thing. So when we were doing contracts and stuff, you try and keep it agile, you keep it broad, because it allows you to be flexible, to iterate and to move with the technology as it develops. And that's kind of what we need now with laws. And that's hard to do. And to do it, you need to keep it simple. Does that
And
make sense?
we, yeah, I was actually thinking about this when you were talking about how we have these various things already regulated, like the banking sector and yeah, so I was thinking about how the banking sector, the healthcare sector, everything has its own regulation, and we
Mm-hmm.
probably have the foundations laid out well. But AI is a different beast, in my opinion, because there's a lot to deal with. Given the very weird things I've been reading about AI, it also sort of there was this very large hackernoon thread that I read recently, where people were going back and forth about how copyright and IP in AI is very, very similar to um like how it should be actually similar to how Google actually implements the search, and how it has won arguments against the lawsuits that have been filed against it for the search and for the scraping of data. Because AI
Mm-hmm.
essentially, if you're looking at it, it does scrape. I mean, I wouldn't say scrape, but
Yeah,
it does take
you're
data that's
talking about
already
text
there.
and data mining. Yeah, it's called
Yeah,
text and data mining. And it's
yeah.
something that a number of countries, I think something like 27 countries, have made rules that are legal in their country. And it's a big controversy here in the UK. And that's really looking at the content that's going into the AI and the rights to use. There's a friction between content creators who want paid for their music, who want paid for their images, and then the AI people who want to train. And I think it's important that our data is used to train, but there needs to be a way for us to work out how we protect creative industries, because actually I think, a bit like open source, their model of royalties is out of date. And it's how we help them to come up with something new that's going to protect the creative industries and allow them to flourish, and allow the AIs, the LLMs, to be tiny models as time goes by, to be trained on that data. So I think it's quite important, because you want that breadth of data. And there's a lot of different component parts to it, which is why there's not a
Yeah,
simple
so
solution, right?
yeah, the reason I was asking you that is because India actually recently released an advisory. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it. I think it was a couple of weeks back or a week back. I'm not really sure when,
Mm,
but it had released this advisory around, how companies can actually leverage the models, and
mm-hmm,
how artificial intelligence models can only be made to can be made available to the users after receiving explicit permission from the government. So essentially
mm-hmm,
they are like seeking more control over the fact that this goes through rigorous amount of maybe testing, and the models and the data itself is sort of regulated properly.
mm-hmm.
And I honestly think it was not done in a very great manner. That is my personal opinion, not speaking for anyone here. But it was one of those things that tied in very beautifully to what you said right now, that
Mm,
it needs to have like a sort of fair use regulation attached to it. I
mm-hmm.
don't know how, but probably I think
Well,
that would
that's
be a
what
very
we've
good.
got in the
Yeah.
US, right? So it starts in the US with this concept of fair use that we don't here in the UK. So we have to look at our exception in a state of flux, because the property office is making a decision about it, and they've been making it for a year based on something called the Valence Report. And we've been expecting a code around this, and it was supposed to come out at the beginning of last summer, then September, then Christmas, and now. And then 2 weeks ago, there was an announcement it was going back to a different department because they couldn't make their minds up. And it's all about this balance between the creators of content, people's privacy, people's confidentiality, and then the utilization of that to train models. And I think what we're talking about when we talk about text and data mining and fair use is we're talking about the common core. We're talking about data that's publicly available, right? And that being open to use. So I suspect there is an inevitability, whatever be used. I don't know that, I haven't seen that from India, and I will look it up after our discussion today. I'm actually sitting at a conference where this afternoon I'm going to look at last year in AI and talk through what's happened. And Elon Musk has let me down this week. That's your normal Thursday afternoon conversation. Elon Musk has let me down, and he's let me down because he said that AIX, AIX is going to open source Grok. And it's going to happen this week, which means today or tomorrow. It could be the weekend, I suppose. And I've been watching like a hawk to see what happens. Because, of course, he's battling OpenAI, which isn't open at all. And he claims that, he was responsible in the early stages for setting that up, and it was going to be an open source foundation. But what does he mean by open source? And until it's
Yeah.
actually open sourced, we won't know. And I really want to see what that is so that we can start to talk about it. Because he's now in a
Exactly.
position where he can have a massive impact on where the future of open source and AI goes.
Exactly. And I think we're actually running way over time, but
Are we?
I, yes, we are. And I never thought I would be able to talk to so much of the legal stuff because I have just gotten into it a little recently, just out of sheer interest. But I'm really glad that we got to do this with you, Amanda, especially after the state of OpenCon. I had a lot of questions, and I'm not sure all of them are answered still, but
Sorry about that.
no, but I still think this does set the conversation ball rolling, and people can discuss this further because, like you said, I don't know whether you said it during the call or outside of it, knowledge is power, right? Essentially knowing about
Exactly.
uh yeah, so that is power, and that's what I even like with advocacy, that's what we try to do. We try to bring this knowledge to people, and it's to set that ball rolling, to understand things better so that we can make more informed decisions. And this honestly was very insightful because I didn't think I'd understand so much, to be really frank with you, because I'm
No, and I'm
not a
really
very
pleased you do. I'm really pleased you do, because what it shows me, Divya, is that you're taking your own power, right? Because all of these things we're talking about relate to your work. They relate to the work that you and the
yep.
other engineers are doing, and you don't have to understand the detail. You don't have to go and read an act, but it's really good that you understand the laws at a high level that are going to, or at least you understand what those impacts will be. So I'm really pleased to be speaking with you today. It's been great fun, but also I hope it's helpful to people.
Yeah, I really do hope that it was helpful. I just want to thank you so much for coming, and for sharing all of your experience. Although I think we might need to do another one wherein I learn a little more and talk to you
And bring our
and quiz
cats.
you more. Yes, and bring our cats. They're actually behind me, although you can't see them. I've blurred it out very strategically. So yeah, that's pretty much it for me. And we got to thank you so much, folks. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thanks, Divya.
I'm not sure if my video is going crazy or if it's my internet, because that tends to happen a little after we fixed the router here. So if my video has been going on and off, that's me. That's not your internet.
Only at the
Just want to
end.
tell.
Only at the
Yes.
end.
Yeah, I just wanted to tell everyone that. So please don't worry. Your internets are not the problem. It's me. I'm the problem. So thank you so much, nevertheless. And I hope to catch you soon at one of the conferences that we probably are going to go together. So here's to, seeing you at more conferences and hopefully at next year's State of OpenCon as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much,
Yes.
Divya. Take care. Safe
Thank you so
travels.
much. You too. Thank you so much. Have a great one.